Well, good morning slash afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the August Geospatial Preparedness community meeting. And today we're going to be having a good guest presentation today from Stacey and Matt from Minnesota talking about critical infrastructure. And feel free to go ahead and kick things off, folks, and we'll focus on your presentation today. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. My name is Matt Goodman. I hope you can see the title screen here from the PowerPoint. Stacey and I are going to talk about sort of what we've been doing here in Minnesota regarding critical infrastructure GIS data. I'm going to start off with some introductory slides. I'm really good at, I think, pointing out problems, so I'm going to handle that part. And then once the problem is well established, I'll pass things off to Stacey and she'll kind of finish up with some more brass tacks on what we've been doing. There we go. So just by way of introduction, well, first of all, I should say thank you to the leadership here, the opportunity to speak with GIS manager types and you movers and shakers for different states across the nation. It's an honor, and we're thankful to be able to kind of share this with you. And we're hopeful that you feel open and welcome to share back with us, because we don't have this all figured out. This isn't the kind of presentation where we're going to show you a nice tidy solution with a bow wrapped around it. There's definitely still work here in Minnesota that we're trying to accomplish, and hearing about your knowledge or experience in this realm would be helpful to us. But why are we talking to you? Neither Stacey nor I are state of Minnesota employees. So just really quick, how we're tied into this. Minnesota has a structure where we have this Geospatial Advisory Council that serves kind of an advisory role in the state. And under that council, there is an emergency preparedness committee. And then under the committee, there's a specific critical infrastructure work group, which Stacey has been leading the charge on. And I have been involved with that for a number of years as well. And so that's kind of our work group's main goal, is to figure out some solutions for the problem that I'm about to present. So Stacey is coming from the University of Minnesota, their Geospatial office, and I am a county employee. I do GIS for the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office, which is in northern Minnesota. And my kind of connection to this whole field is that I frequently get called on as the main point of contact GIS support for our emergency operations center whenever there's something bad going on. And so I'm in many ways, I'm often the consumer, the very kind of urgently needed scenario where you're trying to find certain data quickly while something is happening. So that's kind of my perspective. So, and a quick case in point, this is something from real life. COVID, I chose this as an example because I think it was probably fairly universal when COVID first started kind of hitting the United States. There were no doubt GIS folks at the state level, certainly national level, state level, and even many county level GIS people who were trying to quickly put together some sort of dashboard and do different types of analysis and start keeping track of what's going on. That seems like, thankfully, seems like an entirely different era. But there was a point kind of early on when people realized that this was really hitting our like nursing home type facilities really hard. There was severe scarcity of personal protective equipment. And so, one of the many data sets that I suddenly found myself wanting and needing was, for example, licensed care facilities. And from my perspective as a county GIS person, yeah, I live and work in this community, but I don't normally interact with nursing home data on a regular basis, nor do I really pay attention to what nursing homes are in the city or the county that I live in. And so it's really hard for someone like me sitting in a very dynamic emergency operations center as a GIS person to at the snap of a fingers have a data set that I feel very confident in. And so at least here in Minnesota, and this is sort of obfuscated by a lot of fog, sort of the fog of war. But I believe what we ended up doing initially was pulling down like an Excel spreadsheet from our state health department that had a listing of all the state licensed care facilities. And then we were needing to geocode that and verify those locations, and of course the first few runs through that were really clunky and cumbersome. But then as we became more comfortable with the process and the data we were getting and kind of any anomalies or fallout that we were accustomed to, then it became much easier to do. And then we could, with that fairly authoritative data set, we could then start keeping track of, which facilities had COVID infections going on. And we, deployed a survey 123 to determine, if they're running out of masks or gloves or different PPE. So that's just one example. I think there were probably a dozen different data sets like this during COVID alone that we were trying to, quickly grab and figure out if they were good, so to speak, or accurate and usable. So here's this is just a really rough kind of conceptual overview. So you have GIS data sets, or maybe just data sets, and they're not even geographic, that are administered at the federal level, right? Like airports is a perfect example. The FAA, they're kind of oversight for airports. At the state level, you might have a Department of Education. I'm just giving examples, a single data set example, but in this slide, schools, the Department of Education, I think in most states is keeping track of schools and their statuses and things like that on a regular basis. Fire halls, this might be, there might be a couple possible, but I put it at the county level just because in my own experience, I know St. Louis County, we do keep close track of if a particular fire department, a very rural volunteer fire department sort of ends up having to fold. We know the day they fold. We know exactly when the neighboring fire department is now taking over that territory at the 911 answering point, the PSAP level. So that's a mission critical daily use data set for us. But there might also be for fire halls, we have like a state fire marshal's office that has some oversight and keeps track of fire departments. I won't get into the weeds, but there's different sort of points of authority maybe on that one. And then I tried to come up with an example for a city. This one was a little harder, but maybe local shelters, local emergency shelters or kind of contingency places like that. They may have more authoritative information, down below the county level that the county isn't necessarily tracking with on a regular basis. So you have all these different levels of administration, and this is just government. There could easily be maybe some private sector data sets that are important to critical infrastructure too, that's not put on here. And just a single example from each level, but this slide is trying to show that, there might be, in any given emergency, there could very well be a federal emergency kind of operations center structure stood up, an ICS and incident command. There could be a state one, lots of state personnel trying to make decisions at the state level for state response. There could easily, for the exact same incident, be a county EOC, and they're all trying to collaborate with each other throughout the incident. And then there could also be a city emergency manager who's, responding at the most local level, probably. And all of these different emergency management agencies are responding in theory to an incident, and they might need data or want data from a different level of government, either the level of government above or below them, or like I said, maybe a private sector. So you have kind of you have this need to capture the data at the agency or department where it's most authoritatively kind of administered. And then you have a need to sometimes aggregate it into like a wider, maybe statewide data set if you're collecting kind of county level data, like fire halls, let's say you, and the state wants to use a data set with fire halls, you have a need to aggregate that into all the fire halls covering your whole state. And then you have a need finally to share it appropriately. And let me just take a pause. I forgot to mention, maybe Stacey has this too, but when we're talking about critical infrastructure, at least for the purposes of this talk and our work so far, we're not talking about highly sensitive, secretive things like storage areas for depleted uranium or anything like that. It's more foundational level data sets like where are the schools, where are the law, fire, and EMS stations, things like that, that often become necessary in the case of an emergency response. So the pipe dream, in many of our discussions within our work group here in Minnesota, we often come back to this pipe dream. It's not totally achievable, but the ideal, I think, in most states is to for example, if we could go to a given department at the state who licenses a certain thing, subject matter, and say, hey, if we somehow had the authority to say, hey, you need to now maintain your data set, your licensing kind of oversight data set, whatever system you use in a geographic format, and maybe with like this one or two specific attributes that would be important to emergency managers. You need to do that and then share it widely or appropriately across to other agencies at the county, city, and federal level, above and below you. Obviously, we can't do that. We don't have the authority. We can't provide the funding. But that's the pipe dream, to capture it where it's most authoritatively being maintained or administered or overseen, and then if needed, aggregate it, and then also share it up and down the system so that it's maintained, daily or as as things change, it's maintained in real time and distributed in real time. A couple quick slides. These are from my own experience. I don't think it's going to take a lot of convincing to convince you guys that emergencies and incidents like this happen across jurisdictions. This was the replacement of a pipeline in northern Minnesota that was highly contentious, and law enforcement was trying to avoid kind of the civil unrest that happened in North Dakota when they had a similar project going on. So they convened years in like 2 years in advance of the actual pipeline work. They convened a law enforcement work group to kind of do planning, make sure there's appropriate staffing. And this pipeline spanned something like a dozen counties. It was from the west border of Minnesota to the east border. And the emergency management response happened sort of at a regional level. It was not the state. I wouldn't say the state necessarily took the lead on that, but it was a consortium sort of sheriffs, county sheriffs that got together. So this was a planning and GIS mapping solutions that needed to happen with a handful or a dozen counties cooperating. That was one. Wildfires, of course. This one is kind of an interesting slide of a wildfire that happened in northern Minnesota, and it more or less stayed within the one county shown in the center of the map there, but it came very close and could easily have spread west into the next county over, or east into next county in that direction. So wildfires don't care where the county border is. We had a huge refinery explosion, and this one was actually just across a small water body, the harbor of Lake Superior. It was just across in Wisconsin, so it was across state lines from Minnesota. And the only thing that kept it from becoming a multi-state incident was the wind direction on the given day. So the wind kept it blowing over Wisconsin, but I think if the weather had shifted, it would quickly have become a Minnesota/Wisconsin response. And there were some evacuations that became necessary just from this one. So this slide is slightly transitional. Just a couple more slides and I'm going to hand things off to Stacey, but I alluded to kind of, when an emergency first starts happening, there's a quick grab very often for information, for GIS data. What do we need? Suddenly we need licensed healthcare facilities, or suddenly we need a complete set of schools, public schools, let's say. Here's an example. You're all probably aware that you can go on like Esri's Living Atlas and filter for authoritative data sets. There's a kind of a program we refer to as HIFLD. I guess it's Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data that it has done a really nice job of identifying some important data sets and aggregating them so that there's like a nationwide data set of schools. But there are problems with it. The process, and I believe it's a private sector vendor that's really contracted to do a lot of the work. And the way that it's organizationally set up, I suppose it's not updated and maintained on a ongoing regular basis. So the data, although it's marked and tagged as authoritative, it's often easy to find issues with it, or just data that's out of date. Maybe it's accurate, but it's out of date. It didn't take long looking at my own jurisdiction here in Duluth, Minnesota, and seeing Ordine East Middle School, which does not exist in the location where it's pinned in the data set shown on the map, but further east and south, a number of blocks, and the location pinned in the map is actually a different school called Woodland that had been demolished maybe circa 2010, and it's still pinned in that same spot. The aerial imagery down at the bottom shows the school as it was in 2009, and this is a kind of a commercial mixed-use development. This is actually a college building now. So it has not been a public elementary school or middle school in a very long time, and it's in the wrong location. I'm not pointing these things out to drag anyone's name or work through the mud. Like I said, there are some really good data sets identified. It's just not always super reliable. And then finally, I think this may be my last slide. Yeah. So this is a new school just across town from the one I just showed you. Very nice, snazzy new middle school called Lincoln Park. It was built before 2013. This aerial imagery is showing it in 2013. And if you go on to the HIFLD school data today, right now, this is the current data set in ArcGIS Online. It's got all the schools, and this is that middle school. So it was built over 10 years ago. It's still not in the data set. Sometimes that data is the best starting point that we have, right? So if you need a certain data set, you might end up with no other good source, pulling that HIFLD data set and then just having to go through and vet it or make changes to work with it. But it's not an ideal starting point. So if we could have captured this at our state Department of Education when it was built, when it was initially kind of brought online as a school and put into our state school GIS data set, obviously that would have been more ideal. So bearing lots of bad news, showing the problem. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Stacey please further introduce yourself if you want, and um, give a little more context, and then you can take it away from there. I'm trying to find this stop sharing.
You did.
Okay,
you
good.
did. Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stacey Stark, and I work in Duluth, but I work for the University of Minnesota. I work for a unit called Geospatial, and we do geospatial support across the university system, as well as we have many contracts with state agencies to support some of their work and specialized applications. So I met Matt, actually, I think formally, I met him when we had a contract to update the St. Louis County Hazard Mitigation Plan there in where Matt works. And so now I'm going to share my screen. Great. Okay, so I have been working on hazard mitigation planning for over a decade, and we get contracts from our state Homeland Security Emergency Management Office to update several counties at a time to facilitate their hazard mitigation planning. We work with a planner who conducts one-on-one work with every jurisdictional representative, but we do the geospatial work and pull the reports together. So in this work, we've worked with over 3/4 of the counties, well, more than that. We've worked with all but about 5 counties now in Minnesota doing that work. And as part of this process, if any of you have ever worked on a hazard mitigation plan, FEMA requires that you do a risk assessment of any critical infrastructure in that jurisdiction. And critical infrastructure in this instance isn't defined real specifically. It's not, there isn't a given way to do that. It's just what the counties identify from the lifeline themes as being their critical infrastructure. So when we first started doing this, we would get information from state agency data, from Highfield, and the counties themselves to piece together the critical infrastructure in their county. And that was hard because every county had different sources of data, different sets of data. There weren't statewide authoritative data sets. So then we started thinking, well, we really should just maybe work with the statewide data sets and then ask the counties to verify those statewide data sets so that we can use their verified data in their plan, but then also maintain a statewide version for when we update the state hazard mitigation plan. So we built a tool using Esri Experience Builder to verify some of the basic themes of critical infrastructure. So we just ask counties to verify the emergency services, so fire, law enforcement, schools, healthcare facilities, a subset of those, so hospitals and nursing homes, boarding homes, and dialysis centers, and some other just the critical infrastructure data that we've sort of vetted the themes with the state. And then schools and shelters as well. So each county is able to go in and select their county and what facility type they're interested in, and then get a filtered view of those data, and they can just verify the addresses, they can zoom to it, and if there is a correction, they can edit any part of this basic record, which is just the address, the name, the facility type, and then also, importantly, the location. Our goal here is to actually have critical infrastructure facilities on the building itself. So when we do a risk assessment, we're looking at flooding, for instance, we want to know where the building is, not where the street address is. And if there's multiple buildings or multiple schools on in a campus, like a elementary school and a high school, we want to know the locations of those two buildings. So we ask counties to do this, and if they do have a GIS support person like Matt, we work with their GIS person to just get it into a schema that we can readily upload into our data and merge the data sets. But a lot of these rural Minnesota counties, that mostly in the northwest and the southwest of Minnesota, maybe 2/3 of the counties, they don't have full-time emergency management. They don't have full-time GIS staff. They may not have any GIS staff. It might be done at a regional level. It's pretty hard. So a simple viewer that somebody with some knowledge in the county can use has been really helpful to get that local knowledge. Yeah, and that said, yeah, there's just we also want to feel like the product we're delivering for our rural counties is the same product that we are supporting more urban counties with. So a county, just because they don't have a GIS person and that their emergency manager is half-time driving the ambulance around, I mean, they should have a hazard mitigation plan that has all the same accurate information in it as any other county. So this has been helpful. We get changes from every single county every single time. So it's not a given that these statewide data sets are up to date at all. And yeah, and Matt was talking about the high-field data, not having the school information, and the Department of Education would be the authority of that. And we do use the data from our state schools, and that is better for this particular verification tool. But I think the larger point is, how does a county then know which source to go to if their go-to source is high-field? How do they know that they need to go to the Department of Education and download the most accurate data set and geocode that? Or how do they know that these aren't actually facility locations? So I think this tool has been pretty successful in supporting that. So circling back to how Matt and I are trying to identify and solve some of these workflow issues. I serve on the Minnesota State Geospatial Advisory Council, which is a council that's appointed to advise the Minnesota Geo Information Office. So we have our state GIO in that office, and this council that's made up of representatives from every sector will just support what needs there are in the geospatial community at large. And every year we set forth priorities. So we just brainstorm priorities. We use ones that have been ongoing for years. We can suggest new ones, and then we send out this list of priorities to the geospatial community and others. It's really open to anyone to vote on what the Geospatial Advisory Council should put forth as priorities. And those we ended up this year with about 20. So there's always a lot of things to work on. One of those being the critical infrastructure data workflow, which has been on this list for about 5 years now. And when there's something that rises to the priority level and there's enough support within the community to work on it, then we form a work group. And so this work group, the Critical Infrastructure Assessment Work Group, sits under the Emergency Preparedness Committee of the Geospatial Advisory Council. So when we talked about what we need in this work group, one of the first things we talked about is just how do people know what is the best source and where to go to. So we vetted different data sets, that many that we've talked about from these different sources. And we first just came up with a resource site. So we have a resource site that broadly defines critical infrastructure data, has a list of different things people may be looking for foundational data, not necessarily emergency management. This, obviously, we're using this in hazard mitigation planning, starting to see it used a lot in climate action, priority planning, and other types of comprehensive planning at local levels. And so we want our peers in the geospatial community to know what are the best sources of data. So this is just a snapshot that shows some suggestions for healthcare facilities where this group has vetted and said, yeah, this is the most complete and most accurate source here. For some of these data, for instance, the fire station data that I mentioned at the University of Minnesota, we are actually asking folks to verify those data, and then we actually roll them up and publish them from my unit as the best statewide version. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Our fire marshal is just keeping track of the departments. So they require, how many fire stations do you have? What is the address of the fire department? What is the mailing address? That kind of information. How many staff do you have? But fire station location information is not kept at our state level. Highfield is a better source of complete fire station information. But as Matt mentioned, there's evidence in Minnesota that these data have not been updated for years. And we did kind of go down a rabbit hole trying to figure out how we could push that to be updated, but that wasn't very fruitful. So what we are asking is then the counties to verify their fire station locations and then load. We then publish that back to the state as a public geospatial data set for anyone to use with those locations. I'm just going to now share a success story, one of a few that we've had now, where we've had some different people from different sectors hear about our work group and then learn about the complete data sets and find them very useful. So one example is with our Minnesota Department of Commerce. They had a project with some technical assistance from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and the National Renewable Energy Lab was giving them free technical support to help them with this this tool, the ReOpt tool, that is an analysis tool to look at how renewable energy can be integrated and optimized at critical facilities and other types of critical structures. So they had this support, but they themselves, not being GIS experts or not knowing where to go, didn't know of other sources besides just our GeoCommons and then our Highfield data. And so we were able to help them kind of separate out what data sources would be better in Minnesota, particularly for the data they were looking for. And as a result, they were able to use this project to identify a wastewater treatment plant in Minnesota that was a really great case for renewable energy for backup generation, really cost effective. And they did go through with that. The county's been done some planning and the city is implementing the project. So I point this out just because I think that in addition, for emergency management and planning, there are also funding sources out there that often come from a federal source or other sources. And those people involved might be trying to identify what is the best, what is the facility we should target for this kind of information, or what is the community that needs help with some foundational level services. And if we don't have the best available data to share, we're missing out on what could be a partnership from other states or from federal partners. So in summary, I wanted to just give some next steps. So as a result of this work, we have talked about in the Geospatial Advisory Council at large, and then in our Emergency Preparedness Committee, specifically about how we might have an endorsement process in Minnesota to identify some of these data sets. So for instance, that fire station data set that we have now developed as a statewide data set, how do we tell people that the University of Minnesota, this would be the best available data set? And how do we get people to trust that if that's appropriate? And so we are going to use that as a test case, but at the same time, we are trying to develop a process for endorsement of all kinds of foundational level data. We don't have that in Minnesota. We're looking to the state of Montana, and I saw somebody is on the call from Montana, and we're looking at that as an example of how we might have that council endorse data sets that meet certain requirements in order to get that status. The next thing that we're trying to do is work with our MGAC office to partner with state agencies and facilitate that however we can, where the state agency is an authority for the data, but they might not have the expertise or the resources to keep the geospatial data up to date. And so we're both identifying those partners that need some support from MGO, and MGO is working with them. And then at the same time, if there are state agencies that do have the resources, we're trying to identify, could you be an official steward of this data, and could you put forward your data set for this endorsement so that we can count on it for being the primary statewide data source for this data. And then finally, there's another parallel work group that is important to this whole process, which is a new geospatial advisory work group that's looking at how we get those, once we have data that's endorsed or data that has been approved through like the NG 911 process or the open parcel data initiative in Minnesota. How do we get those data sets so that the other vendors and other federal and national programs see them and integrate them and identify those as the best available? So there's been discussions with Google and Microsoft just as a start to kind of get that started. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, and I think I did, and I see a couple in the chat. So let me just read those real quickly, and then I will answer those. So Daniel's asking, out of curiosity, have you run into any data sharing issues with critical infrastructure data or any restrictions on how it can be shared? So as Matt and I do not work for the state or the state emergency preparedness office, and also the work group's definition, by definition, we are interested in identifying statewide open data sets. So we, sure, there are data sets out there that are critical infrastructure. Matt mentioned some storage facilities that shouldn't be out in the public domain, and we're not running into the issues with that. We're not even talking about that. We're just looking for low-hanging fruit here for planning and for a county to be able to identify where are the schools, where are the hospitals. There are some concerns in our Homeland Security Emergency Management Department with their critical infrastructure data, but we haven't quite figured out how to merge what they're working with what we're working with. we just we don't again, we don't want to have any conflict with what we're sharing. So we're not looking to share that kind of information. But it has created a little bit of a barrier with us working with our state emergency management division, because they're really focused on data that is they think they can't share, even the public data. It's yeah. And then also you were wondering, oh, Matt, you already answered this. Okay, everyone can see that. Critical infrastructure definition. Yeah. Yep. Foundational themes. Yeah, thanks, Matt, for sharing that.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Go ahead if you want to share.
Oh no, I mean it's just the existence of our foundational themes and what we're doing at the state of Montana through our MSDI, or the Montana Spatial Data Infrastructure, and it's something that yeah, that's a part of what we do. And Aaron Fashaway obviously is clearly heavily engaged with the NSGIC community, discussing what we do with data, our data offerings, and how we provide data from our agency.
That's great. And yeah, like I said earlier, Montana has been a great example for us to follow. I think we are at a similar place with how we have some structures in place already, and so we're trying to model our endorsement process and how we categorize things after what you've done. So, thanks.
Very cool. Thank you.
Peter is asking, what method can be used to assist in surveying data sources for Minnesota? P3 benchmarking database has state and public building inventory information, but would we necessarily know about this database? Well, would we know? No, because Pete, I don't actually know about that data set. I would say that we're not at this time. We're still looking at low-hanging fruit, so we're not talking about state buildings, public building inventories, but I did run into that with the state hazard mitigation plan, and our as far as I could tell, in Minnesota, the state building data also was not in a geospatial format, and there are some there's a couple different agencies that have databases with the state agency buildings ownership and rentals and occupancy, and but none that is comprehensive and sharing like or keeping up the geolocation of buildings themselves. So if you know differently, I would like to hear about that information. Yeah, that would be great. Any other questions?
Yeah, Stacy, this is Daniel. One of the things that I'm curious about, going back to the statements that you guys were talking about with Highfeld and obviously data being out of date or not updated, I'd kind of like to maybe drill down a little bit more on that and see if you can talk a little bit more about your conversations that you've had with Highfeld and maybe some of the responses that you got back from the Highfeld program about maybe why they weren't updating the information, or, you know, and I ask about this because I've been on the Highfeld meetings. I've indicated, hey, it would be really, really nice if you guys could just pull from the states instead of contracting with a vendor to provide this data. But I'm curious to hear kind of from another state perspective, you know, as you guys are kind of compiling these data sets, and clearly there are issues that you're seeing with the information that you're providing out there. What sort of feedback you've received from the Highfeld program?
Mm-hmm. It's been mixed. It's been several of us, and there's a few others on this call who even preceded me in this effort to work with them to get Minnesota data into their data sets. And we've had simple answers from them directly, like send your data to this address and we'll make sure that it gets in the data layers, to that there's a coordinating committee and they are looking, for feedback. So join these meetings. And but in every case, it seems like some of the leadership has changed and the organizational structure has changed, and we haven't had a lot of follow through. And honestly, Daniel, I think we just sort of gave up on that. It seems like it's, like you said, it's the federal government is funding private vendors to do this work, and it's really hard. Like if you want to know about one specific layer, trying to call like Oak Ridge National Laboratory and find out, when are they going to get to Minnesota, or it's kind of a black box. And I don't have any good things to, I don't have any advice or insight into how to work with that. In fact, I'm not even clear if it's how well funded it is. And maybe if anyone on the call is from other states, like I'm wondering if maybe there is a focus on some of the more active states that have better data, if maybe they're able to see updates in Highfield more regularly, and maybe it's because we don't have an organized pipeline of data that they aren't seeing Minnesota data. I don't know. I would welcome anyone else to join this conversation about it.
And I'll say from my perspective here in Oregon, we have access to the Highfield data, and I know that we have a data sharing agreement with Homeland Security for the Highfield secure information. But in all honesty, we take the approach of we're always going to use local data first, and if we don't have local data, we're going to reach out to Highfield. So oftentimes, when they're asking about feedback on the Highfield information, well, we don't have much to provide other than, yeah, we have access to it on our common operating picture viewers, but we really don't use the data because our local data is better. So, I don't know kind of what the prioritization, if any, is to integrate with any of the states. And it seems to me, much like what you were mentioning earlier, Stacey, about, hey, join these calls, provide feedback. Well, they're not getting very much feedback because the community is not using it because they know that the data is not accurate for them. So, I don't know necessarily how to put the pressure or a little bit more of a heat on them as far as that topic goes. Emily and I were kind of chatting on the side regarding this particular topic, and maybe this is something that the NSGIC community advocacy community might be able to help out a little bit, and putting a little bit more pressure on Highfield to coordinate and collaborate with the states. Because honestly, it makes a lot more sense if we look at it from, hey, I'm just a general taxpayer, right? Why are we not using data that's already out there and available instead of paying for something that a vendor maintains? Makes a lot more sense to have it filter up, much like we do the speech about all incidents begin and end locally. Why don't we take that same approach with data? So just like I said, I was curious to kind of get your perspective on things, because you've had some more direct outreach. You have specific examples that you provided in the presentation today. So yeah. I'm seeing some other comments in chat here too. So I'll let others talk.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, it's very much like you said, we do have access to all of the data. So that's not, the Highfield data, but it's just, agree with what you said.
It's really interesting that this conversation has gone here, because if we were to go back in time to when our critical infrastructure work group fired up, I think our initial vision was we don't have to reinvent the wheel or any processes. We see that this Highfield data is out there. We just want to try to foster like a more fluid up and down pipeline between local sources all the way up to federal, and to ensure that update, some mechanism to make sure that these data sets get maintained and shared more frequently. And as Stacey shared, it seems like we're frustrated with somewhat with not being able to identify a way to achieve that through HIFLD. And I think Stacey alluded to, I vaguely recall learning about like even funding hiccups maybe. So like there may have been points in time where they were like, yeah, well, we'd like to, make updates to that, but we're waiting on something to go through for funding for it. And so it doesn't seem like it's super fluid. It's more like, it feels to me anyway, like they create a snapshot of the data and then it just lives in that snapshot form until it's too stale to really be usable. And to tag along with that, I would also say that this was sort of one of the big reasons that I and Stacey started to get involved with this particular interest group, is because we felt like there's got to be other states out there feeling the same challenges or pinch points with the HIFLD data, and wishing that things were updated and shared more fluidly. So we kind of saw you guys as sort of an affinity group and partners. So we're happy to try to make progress wherever we can together.
So out of curiosity, can you guys go back to your slide dealing with kind of the validation or the edit process that I think it was either on Stacey's or Matt's slide?
Yeah. This?
Yeah. So I put it, I think, in the chat. I think Matt answered me a little bit. So it sounds like there is a process that you are reviewing and having locals go in and validate and verify that, yes, this is at the correct location. There's a flag that then allows you to accept the edit and move the point, or add specific details on an attribute. When you're doing this local verification, who are you sending this out to, and is it kind of open for anyone to see, or is it a kind of a closed group that you're sharing this with?
Very, very good question. Okay, so when we work with the hazard mitigation planning, we are working with a lead, usually the emergency manager or the deputy emergency manager. And so we send it to that person and then trust that they will share it just with, the people that they trust. So they might share it with a GIS person or with a public health person or something like that. We do have another shadow application that looks the same, but it's at a different link that is open on when you go to that fire station data, we have in the metadata, it says if you see an error in here, you can report it here, and they can still go through the process, but it goes through a different channel so that we know that we need to vet it. So we'll send it then to the local authorities and say, this came through our public website, and is this something that you agree with, and should we update our data set? So the process works great for fire stations and law enforcement. For the other data, and I learned a lot about this data working with Matt, because he is a GIS person who's very knowledgeable working in emergency management. So pretty much best case scenario. But he's like, I don't know where the schools are in, the other side of the county. I can't verify any of this. Like, this is not something that your emergency management can verify. Like, we need the state to do that. So we still take, for hazard mitigation planning, we take the verifications, but we don't, and we'll update it in their hazard mitigation plan and do any, analysis they want using what they said. But then we're not rolling that up into a public data set, because we're still, we want the authority to still be the Department of Health and the Department of Education. And that's kind of the messy part we're working with at the state is, it'd be great if they could be the geospatial steward of those data. and we could get out of the middle. So we're going to share any edits that we have with them if they have the time to verify them. But yeah, so for police and fire, it works great.
And I'm assuming that police and fire, right, those data sets, you have that good working relationship already with those responsible agencies to help kind of steward it moving forward?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Because they don't have any, they are happy to keep their spreadsheets, and they're not getting into the business of geocoding and maintaining geospatial data. And our state Department of Public Service or Safety, and Homeland Security, Emergency Management, those offices don't maintain and create data. So I know that's really different than a lot of states, because some states do have a central emergency management office that is also stewarding data, but we don't have that. So yeah, so it is working here.
I also just throw out there, in some ways, Minnesota has a really strong GIS program at the state level. No offense to you other states, but one of the best, the people in our state GIS office. But and we have a really good open, for the most part, sharing community between different levels of government. But there are certainly some sort of bureaucratic red tape that inhibits. If our governor recently took a new job, so if I could slide in his place and just with the authority and a magic wand unleash our state GIS office, MinGeo, if I could unleash them and fund them across all state departments, they would, within a short span of time, have all the data sets we want from a state level and served out the way that we want it to the people who need it. But that's just not the reality that we live in as far as the structure of our different departments at the state. So there's just some of that kind of bureaucracy, red tape that sometimes takes data sets or authoritative sources of data from a state department, and they just have no business need to do the extra work to make it geographic or put it in a format and share it that would be useful for emergency management. And the other thing kind of dovetailing with that is that, you probably have all seen the same thing, but we're all happy with the data sets that we maintain for ourselves, and they work for our business needs, obviously. That's what we maintain them for. And we don't always see, the level of government above us or below us that may suddenly be wanting that data set. And I think that happens too. I mean, I'm probably a perpetrator of that same thing, right? Like I've got a really good authoritative data set for our county's fire halls, and I'm not always thinking about, someone out there at the state who, some department who might suddenly be wanting to know, like, hey, I wonder, I need to know where the fire halls are in St. Louis County. It's hard for us to remain aware of that. So it's a version of siloing, I think, that we can fall into. But so defense of our state GIS program is extremely good at what they do. I think sometimes they just don't they haven't been given full authority and funding to go and do the things that they wish they could.
So I want to be cognizant of time here. We have enough time probably for one more question. I know we're hitting up against the hour here. So anyone else have any questions? All right, hearing none, I would like to thank both Matt and Stacey for your presentation today. Really appreciate seeing the insight from the Minnesota perspective and all the great work that you guys are doing out there. So thank you so much for talking with us today, and I'm sure that we'll continue to be in touch, especially as we get more engaged with the Highfeld process. I'd like to pull you all in those conversations as we can get some stuff set up with them. So thank you all very much, and we'll go ahead and call the meeting done for today. Thank you all, and feel free to pay attention to more announcements that we'll have coming out as we schedule more meetings with this group. Thank you all very much.
Great.
Thanks
Thanks
for
again
having
for
us.
the invite.